Welcome to In the Middle, a podcast on Christianity in the Middle East, where we explore questions of history, religion, culture, and policy that affects the ancient and indigenous Christian communities of the Middle East. I'm honored to be joined today by Dr. Franck Salameh, professor of Middle East history, culture, and political thought at Boston College, to discuss the rich ethno-linguistic diversity that comprises the Middle East mosaic, and ask the ultimate question, what is an Arab Christian? So, without further ado, thanks for joining the conversation, and welcome to In the Middle. Professor Salameh, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Rich. I'm really honored that you've invited me to have this chat.
Well, it's great to have you. And, I've been really looking forward to today's conversation, particularly because, well, for one thing, I've been following your work for quite some time, but also because a lot of your work builds on some ideas that I've thought quite a bit about, even since childhood. And of course, you present them in a very sophisticated, methodical way. And that is the idea that the Middle East is not an ethno-linguistic monolith. In the West, we tend to talk about the Arab world and are oftentimes intellectually forced to infer that it's a very simple and homogeneous landscape that is linguistically, ethnically, and in terms of experiences and historical memory and ultimately identity. But of course, that's far from the truth. So, Professor, if you could just elaborate on this idea to start, what is the social, cultural, linguistic human texture of the Middle East, and why has it been reduced to this, reconstructed, in favor of an Arab narrative?
Okay, how much time do we have? This is an awesome question. I mean, you can write a PhD dissertation about it. Let me begin by asking you not to call me professor because I don't profess anything to you. If anything, I learned from you as well. So Frank is good. Works for me.
Frank, it is. Thank you.
But no pressure. I'd like to begin with some numbers and to sort of put things into perspective. When the Crusaders came east, when the Frankish Crusaders came east in the 11th century, they came into their world. They did not come into the heartland of Islam. They came into the Eastern Mediterranean, where they encountered people who spoke their languages, people with whom they had cultural affinities, linguistic affinities, religious affinities, even ethnic affinities. I mean, we're talking here about Syrians, not today Syrians, Syriacs, right? We're talking about Copts. We're talking about Armenians. In the 11th century, more than half of the world's Christians were in the Near and Middle East. It's hard to imagine this today. To put this in today's numbers, it's as if you were to say half of the 2.2 billion Christians today live in the Near and Middle East. We're lucky today if we have 10 million Christians left in the Middle East, let alone 1.1 billion. Also, when the Crusaders came east, they came into a world where the majority population was not Muslim. So that's what I mean by the fact that they came into borderlands, borders of Christendom, but also borders of Islam. So they did not go into the heartland of Islam. They went into a world that was familiar to them, where, again, more than half of the population, I would say, some medievalists argue, of course, we don't have numbers, but medievalists like Thomas Madden, like Thomas Asbridge, both of whom wrote on the Crusades, argue that between 60 to 80% of the populations that the Frankish Crusaders encountered were non-Muslims. So what happened? How did these numbers change? It's a long, drawn out process. So the image that we have of Islam coming into our world, and when I say our world, the Near East, um, carrying a book in one hand on horseback and carrying a sword in the other and offering people conversion or death is sort of a an over exaggerated cliche. So for the longest time, the Muslims were a minority in the Near and Middle East, but over the centuries, through different processes of taxation, um, suppression, coaxing, those majorities of non-Muslims ended up converting to Islam. Um, so what? I'm sorry, I forgot
No, yeah, no,
the
that's a wonderful
so I got
introduction actually,
lost
because
in
that
this
takes it
and
back to
um,
yeah, no, that takes it
forgot
back
the
to the
initial.
advent of the demographic shift for sure in the Near East. Um, what I'm looking for, and what I'm curious, and I'm sure our audience is also thinking about, is the logical conclusion of that history and where we've arrived at today throughout the 20th century, particularly after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. It's the social, cultural, and linguistic texture of the Middle East, and why it is that such a formerly once and maybe still diverse region has been reduced to this, solely and purely Arab narrative that we experience today.
Well, I mean, the in the end, the Arab narrative won out. The sort of Islamic or Islamist, not in the negative Islamist sense, but the narrative advanced by Islamists, meaning those who study Islam, um, won out. Mainly because Christians themselves, or some elements of Near Eastern Christians, bought into this story. Um, with the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, um, many Near Eastern Christians feared that the tanzimat that the Ottomans were beginning in the mid to late 19th century, the reforms that the Ottomans had begun, which included doing away with the dhimmi system, the system of unequal relationships between Muslims and Christians, beginning to consider Ottoman Christians on an equal footing as Muslims, not as equal citizens. But I mean, we're not talking about citizenship yet in that sense, not even for Muslims. But they functions on an equal footing. They did away with the taxation system of the dhimmi system. Non-Muslims were able, even encouraged, to serve in the Ottoman army. So many Christians were kind of smitten by this idea of them becoming equal to the Muslims, and did not want to go back to the time of dhimmitude. So they began dabbling with ideas of Arabism as opposed to Islamism, an Arab identity as opposed to um, a Muslim identity. And I mean, the people to blame for the emergence of the idea of an Arab identity and later Arab nationalism are, in fact, Near Eastern Christians, incidentally, the Greek Orthodox Christians, right? Not the Syrian Christians, if you will. But otherwise, Syrian Christians, meaning, you know, Christians who belong to Syrian churches, Syriac speaking churches, the Copts, um, many other denominations already had an identity. They already went by their own ethno-religious identities. The Maronites recognized themselves as Maronites. The Assyrians recognized themselves as Assyrians. The Chaldeans called themselves Chaldeans, and so on. And so the Copts. I mean, so, so what I'm getting at here is that these people had um, what political scientists refer to as pre-modern national churches. So, so the Assyrians are a pre-modern national church, an ethnicity, if you will, that is defined religiously. Um, to give you an example from our own world of references here in the West, um, there's something called uh, uh, the National Church of Norway, or simply the Church of Norway, or the Church of Sweden, or the Church of England. Those are churches that are not proselytizing churches. They are national churches. They belong to a well defined people. We have a parallel to this in the Near Middle East. The the Coptic Church is a national church. The Syriac Church, in many denominations, is a national church. The Maronite Church is called the Syriac Maronite Church. So it has national connotations, and I think the French understood this quite well. So the French refers, if the French in the 19th century and the early 20th century wanted to refer to Near Eastern Christians, they referred to them as chrétiens d'Orient, literally Christians of the Orient or Oriental Christians. The British, who were smitten by the idea of Arabism, began referring to them as Arab Christians. In that sense, the term Arab Christians is both new and misleading. New because those supposed Arab Christians did not recognize themselves as Arab Christians, even though they may or may not have been speakers of a version of the Arabic language. So they didn't recognize themselves as Arab Christians, and they already had names by which they were recognized, and they recognized themselves. Um,
Well, one question I'd have for you on
the
that, and this is these are great points you're bringing forward. The fact that Christians were very much behind the genesis of the Arabist narrative in the early 20th century, and then the fact that you contrast that with these national churches, as you call them, or early national churches. Um, my
pre-modern
my
national churches. Yeah.
my question, coming from all this, is why do we hear so little about this in the public conversation, and particularly, I would say also in academia, we hear so little about this aspect, this facet of modern Middle East history. Why do you suppose that is?
Okay. Uh, um, we hear less about it or not very much about it in the Anglophone academic world, but not in other, specifically the Francophone academic world. So the Anglophone academic world is influenced by, um, I'm talking here post World War One, influenced by Britain's vision of the Near and Middle East, as opposed to France's vision of the Near and Middle East. But perhaps before I develop this further, I want to go back to the pre-modern national churches and the folks who had names that did not include, or demonyms, if you will, that did not include the word Arab. Even Muslims themselves were not attracted by the idea of Arab nationalism, by the notion of referring to themselves as Arabs. Even to Muslims, this was something new, and they warmed to it later on with the coming of the 1940s and 1950s. But initially, Arab nationalism and the notion of calling oneself an Arab was almost exclusive to Greek Orthodox Christians, some Maronites as well, but in the main, Greek Orthodox Christians. But even Muslims had identities already. They recognized themselves as members of the Ummah, not as Arabs. Okay, so there's no ethnicity to Islam in that sense. Going back uh, to the debate on why this idea of Arab nationalism or Arab identity took off and became the norm. Um, the French had this um, notion. I don't know if it's part of their policy of divide and conquer, but we hear much in normative history books about the Near and Middle East. We hear about the French and the British coming and carving out the Arab world into these small states that did not make sense, etc. Actually, if you look at the map that the French inherited from the Ottomans, namely what became Syria and Lebanon, the French kept it as is, the way the Ottomans had divided up that area. So, what became Syria and Lebanon were the Ottoman vilayets, or the Ottoman states, or the Ottoman provinces of Beirut, Damascus, and Aleppo. And those correspond roughly, if you look at the map, they correspond roughly to what is today Lebanon and Syria, and parts of what became British Mandate Palestine. So, to give you an example, so the vilayet, the state of Beirut, was a coastal strip that resembled pretty much the the 11th, 12th century Crusader states, and it extended from what is today Latakia in Syria down to St. John of Acre in present day Israel. This was the state of Beirut. Uh,
Now, contrasting
so what the
that,
French did is, I'm sorry.
yeah, it just it's very interesting that you say that. This is the first I'm hearing that the French preserved, roughly speaking, the Ottoman, concepts or divisions, provincial between Syria and Lebanon. My curiosity now that you've piqued is, did it differ much in how the British handled their areas in say Iraq, Palestine, Jordan? Did it differ much?
So, so So while the French had what one might call a minorities policy, which means that they recognize the diversity of the place. I mean, you see this in archival sources of the French Ministry of the Foreign Affairs, correspondences between the High Commissioner in Beirut and the Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs in France, debating what they should do with these areas, because the British were pressuring the French on uniting the state of Aleppo, the state of Damascus, and the state of Beirut into a single state, a federation or a kingdom. The French were resisting that. So not only did they keep them as is, but they saw the demographic distribution of the place. And of course, they had proteges in the region, namely the Maronites, but also the Alawites. So they carved out a piece of the state of Damascus and the state of Beirut, a mountainous region, and they created the state of the Alawite Mountain. And they did likewise with the southern part of the state of Damascus and created the state of the Alawite Mountains. So they did some cosmetic work, but they kept essentially things as is. They enlarged traditional Mount Lebanon and created what they called Grand Liban, Greater Lebanon, and this was at the behest of the Maronites. Conversely, what the British were doing, while also pressuring the French to do away with these divisions, which were not divisions, essentially, they were, keeping, Ottoman administrative distributions as is. The British were pressuring the French to stitch together all of these administrative units and create a single Syrian federation. They were also at the same time stitching together other provincial administrative units further east in Mesopotamia. For instance, they took the Ottoman state of or vilayet of Baghdad, in the center of what is today Iraq, of Mosul in the north, which had a very high concentration of Kurds and Christians, and Basra in the south, which was traditionally Shiite, uh, overwhelmingly Shiite, and um, and historically, um, uh, it was culturally and certainly religiously more connected to Persia than it was to anything resembling an Arab state. So concomitant to pressuring the French, they were also stitching together these very um, distinct administrative units, creating the Kingdom of Iraq. And
So given
incidentally, um, when Joe Biden was still a senator, and in the run up to the Iraq War in 2000, and when was it, 2003,
3.
um, he said something that very few people remember, and those who remember at the time were mocking him and making fun of him. He said we should just go into that place and bring it back to what it was initially: three distinct separate states: Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. They made fun of him. They said this guy is, like they do today, senile, or I think he was speaking from uh, a premise of someone with a very profound understanding of the history of the place. He recognized that this place, initially had no reasons to be a single state, and it should be brought back to its origins. So it's interesting to see that today, essentially, as Americans, we are fighting um, to keep Iraq together when clearly it does not want to stay together. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the North is an autonomous state. Baghdad is a mess, and the South is still completely Shiite.
It's
Uh,
very interesting to hear that anecdote about Joe Biden some years ago, because it's very telling. Of course, here we are 100 years later, and you hear lots of criticism of Sykes-Picot and the handling of the European powers post World War One. And when you hear an idea like that put forward by Joe Biden, it being struck down as stupid and short-sighted and absolutely ridiculous. So it's very telling the contrast between these two theories. But one thing I wanted to ask you is sort of playing armchair general 100 years later. Um, what would the right design have been? I mean, you mentioned delineation of political borders according to traditional cultures and denominations and so forth. Is that a tenable and feasible design here in the 21st century?
um, I don't know if it's feasible in the 21st century. I know that it was certainly feasible uh, in the early 20th century. That the French were on to something, that they did not want, stir the pot. Um, that they had a clear understanding of the diversity of the place as a mosaic of people uh, that could live harmoniously side by side, but that should not be forced to live together if they didn't want to. And part of the reason why we see a rending Syria today, a rending Iraq today, a Lebanon that is a basket case, is because the Catholic Church will not appreciate that. But divorce should be acceptable. People who do not want to live together should not be forced into an unholy matrimony. But again, to go back to your initial question, the British won out. Their vision won out. They were not interested in minorities. They're the ones who popularized the notion of an Arab, all of these people over there, because they didn't want to refer to them as Muslims. So this was also a Western habit, a habit of a post religious West that did not see people in terms of the religious identities. So they referred to all of the peoples of the region as Arabs, to not say Muslims, just like in the 19th century, they might have referred to them as Turks, to not refer to them as Arabs. Um, their lodestar, the lodestar of the British, was the crown jewel of their empire, India. And the only way they could reach India from the Mediterranean was to have a land bridge. And a land bridge would not be formed by many states, but by a single Arab kingdom. And that's what they fought the French for, to create this large land bridge that would extend from the Mediterranean, from British Mandate Palestine to Iraq, into Iran and the Indian subcontinent. And that's how the French lost, because by 1936, the French were no longer calling the shots in the Levant. By 1940, the French were in the midst of an occupation. Um, so they relinquished essentially their holdings in the Near East to the British, and the British began essentially dictating policy. So by 1936, the French gave up on Syria, clung to Lebanon, uh, because of a whole bunch of reasons going back centuries. I mean, the relationship of Lebanon's Christians to France goes back uh, centuries, if not a millennium. So they relinquished Syria and they accepted what the British had proposed, a Syrian federation. So essentially, um, they put an end to the state of the Alawite Mountain. They put an end to the state of the Druze, and they stitched them together. Stitching together the state of Damascus and the state of Aleppo into a single Syrian republic, what became in 1943 the Syrian Republic.
I tend to agree with your view that, or my understanding of your view, that the French design was indeed preferable for many reasons in the region. Certainly, for religious and ethnic minorities, the French design would have been preferable in theory. Of course, having lost to the British design of the unification of these Arab identities and designing national borders in accordance with those unified Arab identities, having won out, in the ideological tug of war. How now, 100 years later, a century later, are these ethnic minorities? That's not even to say religious minorities, to preserve their ethnic identities. That is to say, the Copts remain Copts in identity, Syriacs remain Syriacs in identity, Maronites Maronites, and so forth. Is it a losing battle at this point?
Unfortunately, I have to say yes. Um, Years ago, Lebanese historian Kamal Salibi, who is no friend of Near Eastern Christians, who, incidentally, I mean, his trajectory is quite interesting. Uh, did I say interestingly? It's quite interesting. He began actually his career as a historian. He studied under Bernard Lewis, and he wrote his dissertation under the direction of Bernard Lewis, and he wrote on Maronite historians, and he was in a way sympathetic to the Maronite narrative, and he referred to them as a distinct people. And later on in the 1950s and 60s, he actually uh, intellectualized the Maronites' myth of origin, speaking of Lebanon, or the Lebanese as descendants of the ancient Phoenicians, and of the Christians of Lebanon, namely the Maronites, as a Christianized Canaanites. So he was the main figure that intellectualized that notion of the Christian Lebanese being not Arab. He turned on himself in the 1970s and 80s, um, and he revised his views. And as he was aging, he became a different kind of historian. He became a historian of the Bible, and later a historian of of Jordan. I think he lived in Jordan for a while. But as recently as 2004, I think a few years before he passed away, he lamented the fact that, and incidentally, he's of Christian extraction, a convert to Protestantism. So you see the American Anglophone influence on him here in the way his mind functioned. But towards the end of his life, named I think it was in 2004, he said, "What the Christians of the Near East today are facing is a fin de race, an end of a civilization." So he saw the exodus of Near Eastern Christians for a variety of reasons. For the one that is favored by historians today is socioeconomic. So they tend to speak very little about persecutions, cultural suppression, cultural replacement, linguistic replacement, and they sort of zero in on socioeconomic issues. But he said what's contributing to this fin de race, this end of a civilization, is this migration, this exodus of Christians. They're generally smart, well educated, highly educated. They're familiar with the languages and the ways of Europe. They integrate easily into their host societies. They're very highly skilled. So they're choosing to vote with their feet and they're moving west. And with each Christian leaving the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, the Fertile Crescent, even among Palestinian Christians, Iraqi Christians, with each one leaving, there isn't another one being born to replace him. And as they're bled out of the Near East, this is the end of their civilization. Unless there is a deus ex machina, unless there is, something from the outside that would decide to, you know, keep these specimens of not only early Christianity, but these specimens of early humanity, keep them in their own birthplaces and help them to flourish and remain. Unfortunately, there are no. We're not living in the 20th century or the late 19th century anymore. There, the traditional sponsors of these people are no more. I mean, you take France as an example. Many Lebanese still cling to 19th century, early 20th century France that created a state for them, which was intended to be a national home for Near Eastern Christians. Um, but unfortunately, France is in a different place today.
Unfortunately, that's a reasonable assessment that the future of Middle East Christians is probably one of diaspora, chiefly. It's very unfortunate to come to that realization, but it looks more and more that way as time goes on. Looking at the diaspora, of course, I'm a member of the diaspora. I'm born and raised in the United States, Syriac identity and origin. I look around my peers and even diaspora Christians from the Middle East of other denominations, and I question their their um, their understanding of who they are and where they're from. Because if we are indeed destined, unfortunately, to be a diaspora community, solely a diaspora community, you want to make sure that that understanding is clear and uncorrupt and clearly understood. I mean, my experience here with friends and other people my age who grew up in the United States is that the term, as you mentioned previously in the conversation, the term Arab Christian seems to be chic and fashionable. And in my experience, it seems to be viewed that way by the more left leaning and progressive, let's say the woke youth of the Middle East Christian diaspora. Why do you suppose that it has such appeal, that the term Arab Christian, among the more left leaning woke circles?
I mean, there are many reasons. The first one that jumps to mind is, the need for oversimplification. You just sort of simplify things, and that's the American way. Just Arab Christian. So what? You're an Arab Christian. You speak Arabic. You're an Arab, and that's generally been a Western um, a Western habit from from the time of the Greeks. That's why they call us Syriacs, because we speak Syriac. So um, um, Americans and Anglophones in general don't have time to look into the details of things. You tell them the place is a mosaic. So what? You speak Arabic. You're an Arab. The academy plays a great role in that, also, sort of normalizing these notions. Uh, uh, they're not really into understanding, the etymological or historical origins of such terms. Um, I had a medievalist one time tell me that for for a for a medievalist, uh, Arab Christian means one of two things. First of all, it's an oversimplification, but medievalists use it with regards to the Christians of the Arabian Peninsula that no longer exist. So that's what this medievalist told me. She said, Arab Christians are the Christians of the Arabian Peninsula, who got expelled, who converted, and who got killed with the coming of Islam. So it's a people that no longer exists. For modernists, an Arab Christian is a Christian of the Near East who speaks Arabic. Now, when you push them on the term, on the verb speaks Arabic, I mean, you want to spend time analyzing what is speak and what is the Arabic language. No one is interested in that. Americans hear a guttural language and they assume it is Arabic, and that's that. Um, People who are interested will deal with the dichotomy between what is Arabic and what are the spoken dialects. And the spoken dialects, are they Arabic, are they something else? I don't want to get into this.
Yeah.
I wrote a book about it, and it's boring to most people. I mean, when I start explaining it in a situation like this, we're sitting at the dinner table or in a salon. Oh,
Well, you know what?
it's Arabic.
I think we have a very particular audience, Frank. So maybe it may be interesting for them to hear a bit about, of course, the role language played in um, the diversity of identity in the Middle East, right? Of course, we understand the Coptic language that once was used, Syriac, and even Lebanese dialect of Arabic, if you want to call it a dialect. But even the role that the so-called Arabic language, or unified Arabic language, played in the role of diversity in the Middle East, it may be interesting to hear.
Okay. When you say an Arab Christian, and by that meaning a Christian of the Near East that speaks Arabic, um, it's as if you were saying in today's Europe, a Latin Christian, right? A Christian of Europe who speaks Latin. Well, nobody speaks Latin today, and by the same token, nobody speaks Arabic. Okay, Arabic is a language that is a ceremonial, that is a cultic language, sometimes referred to as the language of Quran, that nobody speaks to the same extent that Church Latin is a cultic language that nobody speaks. The people of France, of Britain, believe it or not, 60% of the English language uh, is Latin by way of French. Uh, but you don't call English a Latin based language. The people of Italy, the people of Spain, of Portugal, of Romania speak Latin based languages, and yet we don't refer to them as Latins. Um, if we were to assume that the Christians of the Near East speak Arabic based languages, um, and they're not, by the way, because those dialects are hybrids of many linguistic traditions. Spoken Syrian and Lebanese, for instance, are based on a substrat of Aramaic, Canaanite and Aramaic. So their words may be Arabic, to the same extent that words in English are Latin or French, but the structure, the grammar of the language in Lebanon and Syria is Syriac, it's Aramaic, even in certain cases Canaanite. So it's a hybrid of all of these, to the same extent that English uses Latin words um, on a structure that is Saxon, that is Germanic, right? So that's the situation of those minorities whom we call Arabic-speaking Christians or Arab Christians. Incidentally, I want to inject something here and speak of a parallel to the Arab Christian, and that is the Arab Jew. Okay, so and see how the reaction would be among Jews of Iraq, Jews of Syria, Jews of Lebanon, Jews of Egypt, Jews of North Africa, many of whom are very gifted users of the Arabic language, both the cultic Quranic Arabic that they might have gotten an education in, and their local dialects. I wonder how they would react to being referred to as Arab Jews, because this was also an early 20th century habit of the British of referring to the Arabic speaking Jews as Arab Jews. That is a notion that is completely unacceptable from a Jewish perspective.
Why do you suppose the Christian communities were more receptive, or it was more palatable for the Christian communities to accept the title Arab, um, in contrast with the Jews that you just pointed out? Of course, we're talking before the expulsion of Jews in the Arab world in 1948. This was very much the case. Why is it that it was more palatable to Christians than Jews?
Again, because the idea of an Arab identity, an identity based on the use of the Arabic language, is a par excellence Christian, Near Eastern Christian idea, a Greek Orthodox idea. It is the Greek Orthodox Christians, and the name Greek Orthodox is quite ironic here, because both in Arabic, in Turkish, and in Greek, the reference to the Greek Orthodox is Rum, literally Romans, right? Um, but they're called Greek Orthodox in English because the liturgy had, for the longest time before it got Arabized, was in Greek. I mean, the liturgy essentially is the ancestral language of these, what I called earlier, pre-modern national churches. They have their ancestral language that became a liturgical language that today remains the language of the liturgy, and they have relinquished as a spoken language, except for some pockets of Syriacs in Syria and Lebanon, and Assyrians in Iraq, and some pockets of Copts even. But the Copts, even though they have an ancestral language that is a descendant of the ancient Pharaonic language, they've all but relinquished that language in their daily parlance, and they kept it in church rituals and devotional literature. Same thing with the Maronites. Um, so the the attraction of the Christians to that notion of Arabness or Arab identity comes from the Greek Orthodox. In my opinion, they're the ones to blame. But again, it became a mode of survival. So by the 1940s and 1950s, um, you have to keep in mind that this notion of Arabness or Arab identity was completely denuded of religious content. So those Greek Orthodox, I'm blaming them, but they had a goal, and the goal was to um, create an identity construct that did not have religious connotations in it, namely Muslim connotations. So that Arabism that they created at the turn of the century was very rabidly secular. So again, the idea of secularism is par excellence Christian. So it's not, a Muslim does not understand secularism. Of course, I mean, people change. Judaism also does not understand secularism, but Judaism was transformed, over 2 millennia of contacts um, with European Christendom. Um,
So,
so the idea of Arabness from the get go was very attractive to Christians because it did not have Muslim elements. And I mentioned earlier that Muslims were not attracted to Arab nationalism or an Arab identity because they were members of the Ummah. They had their own identity already. They didn't need another one. So in the 1940s and 1950s, new ideologues of Arab nationalism began sort of emerging on the scene and began reintroducing Muslim religious symbolism to Arabism, and that's when Muslims began flocking to the notion of an Arab identity because to them it was a secular terminology for Islam. Um, and uh,
well, one point I just want to
Sylvia
revisit.
Chaim,
You made a very interesting point that while the early professors, let's say, of Arabism were indeed Christians, but specifically Greek Orthodox, and also you pointed out that this Arab nationalism was a uniquely secular idea. So it didn't necessarily have to do with their Greek Orthodoxness, of course. It just so happened that they coincidentally or not so coincidentally happened to be of that denomination. Why do you suppose that idea was appealed or was popular among that community if it wasn't necessarily for the fact that they were Greek Orthodox?
very good question. Very good question. Um, Unlike the Copts, who had a core area, Upper Egypt, this is where the highest concentration of Copts is. Unlike the Maronites, who had the mountainous region of Mount Lebanon, a very tightly knit society in a very well delineated geographic region, well protected. Unlike the Syriacs of Syria that were also, you know, in a well delineated region. Unlike the Assyrians of Iraq, well ensconced in northern Iraq, historic homeland, the Greek Orthodox were uh, were were the Romans. They were the Rum, as they say in Arabic and in Greek and in Turkish. They were all over. They did not have a specific region to identify with. They were all over the region, and that's why in also, you know, non-Arab nationalist conceptions of Syrian nationalism that is also Greek Orthodox, you see the entire region that witnesses um, uh, the the high demographic concentrations of Greek Orthodox. Wherever there are Greek Orthodox, it becomes part of what they want to call the Arab world or the Syrian, Greater Syria, for instance. The notion of Greater Syria, if you look at the map that Antoun Saadeh drew, for instance, for Greater Syria, it follows the contours of where there are communities of Greek Orthodox. So modern day Syria, modern day Lebanon, parts of modern day Iraq, not all of it, but Western Iraq that had some Greek Orthodox, parts of Palestine that had Greek Orthodox, and the crown jewel of the Rum, the island of Cyprus. That was also part of the map. So the Greek Orthodox, whether advocating for Arabism or advocating for Syrianism, followed the distribution, the demographic distribution of the Greek Orthodox because they were so spread out and did not have core region to identify with.
So it sounds as though, at the end of the day, as you've said, as we've discussed, it was more because they were more integrated in society, if not geographically, maybe even culturally, and it was a means for preserving the Christian community because it was the secular alternative, because it was the least of all evils in many ways. Which is very unfortunate because that's the position Christians seem always to have been in the Middle East, stuck between warring factions, between shifting tides between emperors and in majority communities. We've always been stuck in the middle, and that's kind of the conclusion we always come to with many of these conversations, which is very sad, unfortunately, but very little to celebrate in the larger story arc of Christians in the Middle East.
There are two kinds of Near Eastern Christians that continue to live, even though they're dwindling. They keep hope by living vicariously through two examples of minority survivals that had shown some staying power. I'll go very quickly. I know we need to conclude very soon, but I'll go very quickly through 4 or 5 models that Near Eastern minorities in recent times, 20th century, have used in order to have used for the purpose of self-preservation. Um, the first model is that of is what I call the Dhimmi model, and that is the model of the Copts. So, in order for them to survive as a faith community, no longer a cultural or national community, they submit. They submit to, Egypt. Egyptian law, Egyptian constitution is inspired by the Sharia. So they submit to that. They live quietly. They're left alone until they are not, and they are dwindling. But that's the choice that they made. So that's a Dhimmi model. The second model is what I call the Janissary model, the Janissary model. The Janissaries, for those who don't know, are a very sort of, you could call it the special forces of the Ottoman army. And the Janissaries initially were the result of blood tributes. So every 10 years or so, the Ottomans went into Christian lands, namely the Balkans, and collected this blood tribute. And that is, 4 to 5 year old boys, Christian boys, that they would take, uh, kidnap essentially, and raise as Muslims. And those neophyte Muslims would become the most committed fighters for the Ottoman, and many Janissaries became viziers, grand viziers within the Ottoman structure. So essentially, espousing the identity of the dominant culture, espousing the identity of the Muslims, and in a sense, the survival mode that the Greek Orthodox chose was that of the Janissaries. They espoused the identity of the dominant culture. They espoused the identity of the dominant Muslims. They called it Arab. Arab today is, the other facet of Islam, is the secularized facet of Islam. So that's the second model. The third model is that of probably the Alawites of Syria, who are not Muslim, but who claim to be Muslim in order to survive in a Muslim dominated region. And not only do they outwardly claim to be Muslim, but they also adopt the cause célèbre of Islam today, which is Arabism, Arab identity. So Syria is, one of the most vociferous, the Alawites of Syria, one of the most vociferous advocates for Arab identity. But if you go into the history of the Alawites, they're the farthest thing from Arabs. If you look at their recent history, the Syria's Alawite, or the Syria of the Alawites, has been the most peaceful border with Israel. And if you look at Israel and the Palestinian cause as the cause célèbre of Arabism, you'll understand that this is kind of strange that the Syrians would advocate for Arab nationalism, but yet they have the most peaceful um, border with one of the most salient opponents of the notion of Arab nationalism. So that also, is a what you might want to call a pretense of Arab identity, pretending to be an Arab in order to be left alone, in order to be able to survive in an Arab or a Muslim dominant society. The fourth model that was very successful for a while was the Lebanese model. So let me speak first about the fifth model, which is the Israeli model, the Jewish model. So the Jewish model decided, I'm not going to deal with dimitude. I'm not going to deal with pretending to be this or the other. I'm not going to espouse, Arab identity, even though the majority of Israelis today are originally Arabic-speaking Jews that came from Arab lands. So that, demographically, they're more preponderant than European Jews. So the Israeli model essentially decided to do away with notions of Arabism, with notions of submitting to the dominant culture, with notions of living as dhimmis, and they decided to build a citadel, build a castle, build a military powerhouse in the Middle East. One of the most powerful army in the Middle East, if not among the most powerful military forces, period. So they built a fortress. The jury is still out on this fortress. We don't know how long uh, Israel will, or the Jews choosing that model, we don't know how long they'll be able to hold down the fort. Israel today has a very serious PR problem around the world, but they're soldiering through. So this is the fifth model, if you will. The fourth model is the model of the Maronites of Lebanon. They were um, uh, given the opportunity by the French to build a fortress, sort of like Israel, to build a national home for Near Eastern Christians, just like Israel is a national home for Jews, for others as well, if they so wish to live within a Jewish defined state. So Lebanon was intended also to be a national home for Near Eastern Christians, for others also, of course, certainly, if they so desire, but a national home for Near Eastern Christians. And note, I'm not saying a Near Eastern Christian national home, a national home for them, which means for others as well. So rather than opting for that, and of course building a fortress in order to protect that idea of a national home for Near Eastern Christians, the Maronites opted for something that is very Christian, and that is dialogue, a conversation, a quest, a dialogue of civilizations. So they opted for a multicultural, multi-ethnic state, um, based on consensus between Christians and Muslims, and that worked for a while, and it worked very well. But as as we know, as with everything that is built on consensus, um, at one point you end up hitting a brick wall. And once you hit a brick wall, you have to do something to breach it. And one of my favorite ways to breach a brick wall is to break it. And that's how Lebanon broke down and essentially is today, uh, you know, um, on its quest to wanting to be everything for everybody, the Lebanese, and namely the Maronites of Lebanon. And I say the Maronites because Lebanon was a Maronite idea. They're the ones who twisted France's arm in order to create that state. So in their quest for dialogue, for consensus in their quest to be everything for everyone, they ultimately forgot to be themselves. So what I began saying is that, the dwindling Christians of the Near East have traditionally looked with some affection and actually lived vicariously through these two models: the Israeli model, the minority as a powerhouse, and the Christian Lebanese model, the minority as an intermediary, as a conduit between cultures, and aim to live through these models. Unfortunately, the Lebanese model is dying, and Lebanese Christians are dwindling demographically and, more importantly, culturally. So what remains is the Israeli model, and as I said, that model, although successful for Jews, has a serious PR problem, and um, nobody's willing to make a prediction on how long it'll last, or if indeed it will last. And once that fort is broken, I think this would, in fact, be the end of a civilization, the end, essentially, of Judeo-Christian civilization in the Near East.
So you finished basically going through the five models, and you ended on actually a grim note. And it's a note that we're all too familiar with, and it's really unfortunate that that's usually the tenor of the conversation. But that's kind of where we're at, and it's something to think about. It's something to consider, as we discussed in academia as well as in the diaspora, because this seems to be the future of the Middle East community. If we hope to retain any diversity or any of our character as linguistic, ethnic. Peoples here in the diaspora. But I thank you for your time. I thank you for your thoughts. Really enlightening stuff to think about. And we look forward to chatting again.
Thank you for the opportunity. I I love talking about this stuff. I think, I consider myself, to maybe to the chagrin of many who don't share my opinion, not only as an academic who works on these issues, but I consider myself also a public intellectual. I don't have a very loud voice, but I use it every chance I get. And in my own research and scholarship and teaching, I make sure that this is a very salient point in what I do. And actually, um, it's amazing to read my students' evaluations. A lot of them are very bad, but the good ones really appreciate, discussing topics that are outside of their comfort zones, and topics that are very rarely, if at all, spoken about um, by academics who deal with the Near and Middle East. So it's an ignored cultural, intellectual, linguistic, historical corner of the Near East that deserves to be spoken about all the time. And that's, I see this as my vocation as a public person in the classroom, but also in my own research.
That's great. We talked earlier a bit about the sometimes what we see to be laziness in academia, and it's unfortunate. But honestly, knowing you for the time that I've known you, which is a number of years, I've seen nothing but intellectual rigor coming forth out of you, and I certainly appreciate that, and many others do. I'm certain. So always a pleasure
Thank
to
you.
talk, Frank.
Thank you, Rich. The pleasure is all mine. I am grateful for this opportunity, and I wish you the best of luck and bon courage with everything that you're doing. I really appreciate that.
Thanks a lot, Frank. Talk soon.